There's a strange moment many people experience, but rarely talk about, the moment when you realize you re-apologizing even though you didn't do anything wrong, even though you were right, even though you were the one hurt, misunderstood, or disrespected, and yet the word sorry still slips out of your mouth almost automatically, not because you feel guilty, but because silence feels heavier, tension feels unbearable, and peace feels safer than truth. This habit doesn't come from politeness alone, and it's not kindness in the simple sense. It's psychological conditioning built slowly over years, often starting in childhood, where love, approval, and safety were connected to compliance rather than honesty. People who apologize when they're right are usually not weak or unaware. In fact, they're often deeply empathetic, emotionally intelligent, and highly observant of other people's moods. But that same sensitivity becomes a trap when their nervous system learns that conflict equals danger. Somewhere along the way, their brain learned that harmony must be preserved at any cost, even if that cost is self-betrayal. Even if it means swallowing truth, shrinking emotions, or carrying blame that was never theirs. Many of these people grew up in environments where expressing disagreement led to punishment, emotional withdrawal, guilt, or chaos. So their survival strategy became emotional smoothing, anticipating reactions, softening words, apologizing preemptively to avoid escalation. Over time, this strategy turns into muscle memory, a reflex that activates before logic even gets a chance to speak. And the apology becomes less about accountability and more about emotional damage control. Psychologically, this is rooted in people-pleasing behavior, which is not a personality flaw, but a learned response to unpredictability. When someone learns that being easy, agreeable, or unconfrontational keeps relationships stable, they start associating self-silencing with safety. The brain reinforces this pattern through relief. Every time tension dissolves after an unnecessary apology, the nervous system receives confirmation that apologizing works, even if it creates long-term self-erosion. Over time, this builds an internal hierarchy where other people's comfort consistently ranks above one's own truth, and being right starts to feel irrelevant compared to being liked, accepted, or left alone. This is why people who apologize when they rewrite often feel exhausted after social interactions. They're not tired from talking. They're tired from constantly monitoring emotional temperature, adjusting themselves, and managing outcomes that aren't theirs to manage. Another layer of this psychology is guilt conditioning, where individuals internalize responsibility for other people's emotions, believing that if someone is upset, it must somehow be their fault, even when logic clearly says otherwise. This belief doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from hyper-responsibility, a mindset where emotional labor becomes second nature and boundaries feel like cruelty. In these people, the inner dialogue is rarely loud or dramatic. It's subtle and persuasive, whispering things like it's not worth arguing, just let it go, or say sorry and move on, even when something important is being dismissed. What makes this pattern especially painful is that these individuals often pride themselves on fairness, honesty, and self-awareness, so every unnecessary apology creates a quiet internal contradiction, of feeling of shrinking, of abandoning oneself in small but repeated ways. Over years, this can lead to resentment that has nowhere to go, because the person who's hurting doesn't feel entitled to their own anger. They may appear calm, agreeable, and emotionally mature on the outside, while internally carrying a sense of invisibility, as if their needs only exist when they don't disturb anyone else. Psychologists often link this behavior to anxious attachment patterns, where maintaining connection feels more urgent than maintaining authenticity, and losing approval feels like losing safety itself. This doesn't mean these individuals lack confidence. Many are competent, capable, and intelligent, But confidence in skills doesn't automatically translate into confidence in emotional boundaries. In fact, high empathy can increase this pattern, because the more accurately someone reads emotional cues, the more pressure they feel to neutralize discomfort even when the discomfort belongs to someone else. Over time, apologizing when right becomes a way of avoiding the deeper fear underneath. The fear that standing firm might lead to rejection, abandonment, or being seen as difficult. And the most ironic part is that the apology often works in the moment. It smooths things over, keeps peace, avoids awkwardness, but slowly teaches the psyche a dangerous lesson that truth is optional and self-respect is negotiable. By the time someone notices this pattern, it's usually because they feel chronically misunderstood, unheard, or taken for granted, even though they're the one constantly trying to understand everyone else. And that's where the real psychological cost begins. Not in the apology itself, but in the quiet realization that being right no longer feels powerful. Because the habit of apologizing has trained the mind to believe that peace without authenticity is better than conflict with self-respect. The long-term psychological impact of apologizing when you rewrite dosen T show up all at once. Sit accumulates slowly, like emotional debt, where every unnecessary sorry withdraws a little bit of self-trust, until one day you hesitate before speaking at all, questioning not just your words, but your right to have them. Over time, this pattern reshapes identity, because identity is built on repeated self-assertion, and when assertion is replaced by appeasement, the self becomes quieter, less defined, and increasingly dependent on external validation. People trapped in this cycle often struggle to pinpoint why they feel disconnected from themselves. Because nothing dramatic happened, there was no single betrayal, no obvious trauma, just years of choosing ease over truth, silence over friction, and harmony over authenticity. Psychologically, the brain begins to associate assertiveness with danger and compliance with reward, even in situations where disagreement would be reasonable, healthy, or necessary. This leads to a subtle form of self-doubt, where being right no longer brings clarity or confidence. Instead, it brings anxiety about consequences, about how others might react, about whether asserting truth will make one too much. Many people in this pattern become excellent communicators on the surface, skilled at explaining, softening, and contextualizing their words, yet deeply uncomfortable with simple statements like "I disagree" or "that wasn't my fault," because those statements feel emotionally risky. Over time, this avoidance of emotional risk creates an internal split. The logical self knows the truth, while the emotional self prioritizes safety, and the apology becomes the compromise between them. This split often manifests as chronic guilt, people-pleasing burnout, or even physical symptoms like tension, fatigue, or anxiety, because the body carries what the voice suppresses. One of the most damaging effects of this behavior is how it trains others, often unintentionally, to expect accommodation rather than mutual respect. When someone consistently apologizes, even when right, others may unconsciously assume authority over truth, reinforcing an uneven dynamic where accountability flows in only one direction. This doesn't mean others are malicious. Human relationships naturally adapt to patterns, and when one person consistently absorbs discomfort, the system adjusts around that absorption. Psychologically healthy boundaries disrupt this system, which is why people who start breaking this habit often feel intense guilt at first, not because they're redoing something wrong, but because they're doing something unfamiliar. Guilt, in this context, is not a moral signal, but a withdrawal symptom from people-pleasing conditioning. Learning to stop apologizing unnecessarily requires rewiring the nervous system, not just changing language, because the urge to apologize often arises before conscious thought. This is why simply telling someone "don't say sorry" rarely works. The behavior is rooted in emotional memory, not logic. Healing begins when a person starts tolerating discomfort, the discomfort of silence after a disagreement, the discomfort of someone else's disappointment, the discomfort of not fixing everything immediately. This tolerance is not cruelty. It's self-respect in practice. Over time, replacing automatic apologies with neutral statements like "I see it differently" or "that wasn't my intention" helps retrain the brain to associate honesty with safety. The goal is not to eliminate apologies. Healthy apologies are essential for accountability, but to restore meaning to the word sorry, so it reflects responsibility rather than fear. As individuals reclaim their right to be right without apologizing, they often notice a shift in how they feel internally. Less resentment, more clarity, and a surprising sense of calm that comes from alignment rather than approval. Relationships may change, some deepen through honesty, others fall away because they relied on imbalance, but what remains is more authentic. Psychologically, this process rebuilds self-trust, because every moment of truth spoken without apology reinforces the belief that one's voice matters. Over time, being right stops feeling like a threat to connection and starts feeling like a natural part of it. And perhaps the most profound shift is internal. The realization that peace does not come from constant appeasement, but from living in alignment with one's own truth, even when that truth is quiet, firm, and unapologetic. When someone finally learns that they don't have to say sorry for existing, for thinking differently, or for standing their ground, the apology loses its power as a shield and self-respect takes its place. Not loudly, not aggressively, but steadily, as a grounded presence that no longer needs permission to be real. At some point, people who habitually apologize even when they rewrite begin to sense a quiet but persistent loss, not dramatic enough to name, yet heavy enough to feel, and that loss is the erosion of their inner authority, the subtle weakening of the belief that their perspective has weight simply because it exists. This stage is where the psychology becomes less about behavior and more about identity, because when someone consistently invalidates their own truth through unnecessary apologies, the mind starts internalizing a dangerous narrative. That correctness is secondary to comfort, that clarity must bow to consensus, and that being understood matters less than being tolerated. Over time, this internal logic reshapes how decisions are made, how boundaries are set, and how desires are even recognized. Many people in this pattern struggle to answer simple questions like "what do you want?" or "what do you think?" not because they lack opinions, but because they've trained themselves to scan for external reactions before accessing internal truth. Their intuition becomes quieter, not weaker, drowned out by a constant mental rehearsal of potential consequences. Will this upset someone? Will this cause tension? Will this make me look difficult? And when the mind is always negotiating, the self is never fully present. Psychologically, this creates a form of learned self-distrust, where one's initial reactions are automatically questioned, softened, or reframed, often without conscious awareness. This is why many over-apologizers describe feeling foggy or disconnected during conflict. Their nervous system shifts into appeasement mode, prioritizing emotional safety over cognitive clarity. In this state, the apology becomes a tool to exit discomfort quickly, even if it means abandoning one's own position. Over years, this can lead to chronic dissatisfaction, because a life built on emotional compromise rarely reflects true values. People may achieve external stability, relationships, jobs, social approval, yet feel an internal emptiness, as if they're playing a role rather than living authentically. This emptiness is not a sign of ingratitude. It's a psychological signal that alignment has been sacrificed too often. Another hidden effect of apologizing when right is how it distorts accountability in relationships. When one person consistently takes responsibility for emotional tension, others are relieved of the opportunity to self-reflect, creating dynamics where imbalance feels normal. This can foster subtle resentment on both sides. The apologizer feels unseen, while the other may feel vaguely dissatisfied without understanding why. Over time, the apologizer may begin to feel invisible, not because they aren't present, but because their presence is always adjusted, filtered, and edited for acceptability. This invisibility often fuels a quiet anger that feels unsafe to express, leading to internalized frustration that has nowhere to go. Psychologically, suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It turns inward, manifesting as self-criticism, anxiety, or emotional numbness. Many people in this pattern describe feeling too sensitive or too emotional, when in reality, they've simply never been allowed to fully occupy emotional space without apology. Healing this pattern requires a fundamental shift, not toward aggression or confrontation, but toward internal permission. Permission to pause before apologizing. Permission to feel discomfort without immediately resolving it. Permission to let others sit with their reactions without rushing to fix them. This is difficult because the brain interprets these moments as risk, even when no real danger exists. That's why growth often feels wrong before it feels right. The first time someone resists an unnecessary apology, their body may respond with anxiety, guilt, or fear, not because they're being unkind, but because they're breaking a long-standing survival pattern. Over time, however, these reactions soften as the nervous system learns a new truth, that authenticity does not equal abandonment. Replacing apologies with grounded statements like, "I understand your perspective," or "That's not how I see it," allows honesty without hostility, clarity without cruelty. The goal is not to become rigid or dismissive, but to restore balance between empathy and self-respect. As this balance develops, something powerful happens. Internally, the person begins to trust themselves again. Their thoughts feel clearer. Their emotions feel more grounded. Decision-making becomes less exhausting because it's no longer filtered through constant self. Relationships begin to change as well. Some become more honest and resilient. Others fall away because they relied on compliance rather than connection. This can feel painful, but it's also revealing, because relationships that require self-erasure are not sustainable without cost. Psychologically, reclaiming one's right to be right without apology strengthens identity, because identity thrives on consistency between inner truth and outer expression. Over time, the word sorry regains its original power. It becomes a genuine acknowledgement of harm, not a reflexive shield against discomfort. And perhaps the most meaningful transformation is internal. The realization that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of self-alignment. When someone stops apologizing for their clarity, their needs, or their existence, they don't become louder or harsher, they become steadier. Their voice carries weight, not because it demands attention, but because it no longer disappears. And in that steadiness, they discover something they were never actually missing: the quiet confidence of knowing that their truth does not require permission to exist.